The November fog of 1894 had settled upon London like a grey shroud, transforming our familiar Baker Street into a ghostly corridor where gas lamps struggled to pierce the gloom. From our sitting-room window, the street below appeared as little more than a series of amber halos floating in an ocean of mist, occasionally disturbed by the dark silhouettes of hansoms and omnibuses that loomed and vanished like phantoms in the murk. I had been attempting to read the morning edition of The Lancet, though my attention was repeatedly drawn to my friend Sherlock Holmes, who sat curled in his favorite armchair like some great, contemplative cat. He had been unusually quiet since breakfast, his sharp gray eyes fixed upon the chemical apparatus that cluttered his corner table, where a series of glass tubes contained what appeared to be various samples of tobacco ash suspended in different solutions. "You are wasting your time with that article, Watson," he observed suddenly, without shifting his gaze from his experiment. "The author confuses correlation with causation in the third paragraph, and his statistical methodology is fundamentally flawed." "You haven't even glanced at my paper," I protested, though I had grown accustomed to such demonstrations of his peculiar abilities. "On the contrary, I examined it yesterday when you left it folded beneath your medical bag. The crease pattern and the small stain of iodine on the corner, no doubt from your morning surgery, make it quite distinctive." His lips curved in a slight smile. "Your loyalty to medical literature is admirable, though not always profitable to your peace of mind." Before I could formulate a suitable response, the sound of urgent footsteps echoed from the stairwell below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's voice, raised in what appeared to be gentle but firm remonstrance. Holmes's entire demeanor changed in an instant, his languid pose replaced by the alert tension of a hunting hound catching a scent. "Unless I am very much mistaken," he murmured, rising from his chair with fluid grace, "we are about to receive a visitor whose composure has been thoroughly shaken by recent events. The step is that of a gentleman, but irregular. Note the slight hesitation every third or fourth stride. He climbs our stairs with purpose, yet dreads the conversation he must have." A moment later, Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door, her usually composed features showing signs of concern. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, there is a gentleman to see you, a Mr. Edmund Blackwell. He insists the matter is of the utmost urgency, and I must say, he appears quite distressed." "Show him up immediately, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes replied, already reaching for his pipe. "And perhaps you might bring some brandy. I suspect our visitor will require fortification." The man who entered our sitting room was the very picture of a successful London gentleman, well dressed in a frock coat of excellent cut, with silver-streaked hair, and a carefully maintained beard. Yet his usual dignity had clearly been compromised by some recent shock. His face was pale, his hands trembled as he removed his gloves, and his eyes held the haunted quality of a man who has witnessed something that challenges the very foundations of his understanding. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I have come to you because Scotland Yard has proven utterly inadequate to the circumstances. My brother is dead, sir, and the manner of his death is so extraordinary, so completely inexplicable, that I fear his murderer will escape justice unless your remarkable talents can illuminate what appears to be an impossible crime." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite his own, his keen eyes already studying our visitor with intense interest. "Please, Mr. Blackwell, compose yourself and tell us your story. Begin at the beginning, and omit no detail, however trivial it may seem. I have encountered many strange circumstances in my career, and few have proven truly impossible once subjected to methodical analysis." Blackwell accepted the brandy Mrs. Hudson provided, taking a steadying draught before beginning his remarkable tale. "My brother, Sir Charles Blackwell, was a baronet of considerable standing and wealth. He maintained a townhouse in Belgrave Square, where he lived quietly with a small staff of trusted servants. Charles was 62 years of age, in excellent health despite his advanced years, and possessed of a sharp mind and vigorous constitution. His household? Holmes inquired. 5 servants in total. Graves the butler, who had served Charles for 20 years, Mrs. Pemberton the cook, 2 housemaids, and a footman. All had been with him for years and were considered beyond reproach. Pray continue. 3 nights ago, Charles retired to his study after dinner, as was his custom. He informed Graves that he expected no visitors and wished to attend to some correspondence without interruption. At 10:30, Graves brought him his nightly glass of warm milk. Charles occasionally suffered from insomnia and found him alive and well, working at his desk. Charles dismissed him for the evening, and Graves retired to his quarters on the upper floor. Blackwell paused, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his brandy glass. The next morning at 8 o'clock precisely, Graves entered the study to open the curtains and discovered my brother still seated at his desk, in exactly the same position as the night before. He was quite dead, Mr. Holmes. Stone dead. But here is what makes this case utterly baffling. He was sitting perfectly upright, as though he were still alive and working. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with interest. The study was secure? Locked from the inside. The key was still in the lock, turned to the locked position. Every window was fastened from within, and there was no other entrance to the room. The police surgeon, Dr. Langley, examined Charles thoroughly and could find no obvious cause of death, no wounds, no signs of poison, no indication of violence whatsoever. His conclusion was natural causes, perhaps sudden heart failure. Yet you remain unconvinced. I am, sir, and for good reason. Blackwell reached into his coat and withdrew a small envelope. This was found in Charles's waistcoat pocket. It was not there when Graves brought the milk. Charles had removed his coat and waistcoat, as was his habit when working late. Yet in the morning he was fully dressed, and this note was in his pocket. Holmes examined the card within, and I leaned over to read the precise copperplate writing. The debt has been collected. Most intriguing, Holmes murmured. Tell me, Mr. Blackwell, was your brother a man who might have incurred debts, not necessarily financial, that could inspire such calculated revenge? Blackwell shifted uncomfortably. Charles made his fortune in India 30 years ago, in trade and speculation. I cannot say with certainty that all his business dealings were entirely scrupulous. But that was 3 decades past, Mr. Holmes. Surely any grievances would have been settled long ago. Revenge, Holmes observed quietly, is indeed a dish best served cold, but you have not yet told me why you are so certain this was murder rather than an elaborate coincidence. Blackwell met Holmes's penetrating gaze with steady resolve. Because, Mr. Holmes, my brother was not the first. 3 weeks ago, Colonel Weatherby was found dead in his study under remarkably similar circumstances, sitting upright at his desk with no apparent cause of death. He too had served in India during the same period as Charles. The police attributed his death to natural causes and closed the investigation. But now, with Charles dead in exactly the same manner. You believe we are dealing with a systematic killer, Holmes finished. Someone with both the means to commit impossible murders and the patience to execute a long-planned revenge. Precisely. Holmes rose with sudden decision. His earlier lethargy completely vanished. Mr. Blackwell, you were quite right to come to me. This case presents features of extraordinary interest, and I believe we are indeed dealing with a murderer of unusual cunning. Watson, fetch your coat and medical bag. We must examine Sir Charles's study immediately, before any further evidence is disturbed. As our visitor departed to await us at Belgrave Square, Holmes turned to me with an expression I had learned to recognize, the look of a master detective who has caught the scent of a truly challenging quarry. What do you make of it, Watson? He asked, reaching for his own coat. It seems utterly impossible, I replied. A man cannot be murdered in a locked room with no signs of violence, then arranged to appear alive. Yet the note suggests deliberate malice, and the connection to Colonel Weatherby cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Impossible? Holmes's eyes sparkled with anticipation. My dear fellow, you know my methods. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And I suspect we are about to discover that our killer's methods, while ingenious, are far from impossible. Come, Watson, the game is afoot, and I fancy we are dealing with an adversary whose cleverness may prove a worthy match for our own. With that, we descended into the fog-shrouded streets of London, bound for Belgrave Square and the first scene of what promised to be one of our most intellectually challenging cases, the mystery of gentlemen who die sitting upright, leaving no trace of how death found them in their locked and guarded sanctuaries. The fog had thickened considerably by the time our hansom reached Belgrave Square, transforming the elegant Georgian facades into ghostly silhouettes that loomed and vanished in the swirling mist. Holmes sat opposite me in contemplative silence, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the amber glow of passing street lamps. As we approached our destination, he stirred from his reverie with that sudden alertness I had learned to recognize as the prelude to one of his characteristic observations. "You noticed our client's cuffs, Watson?" he inquired abruptly, his keen eyes fixed upon the fog-shrouded square beyond our window. "Blackwell's? I confess I paid them little attention." "A pity. Your medical training should have made you sensitive to such details. There was a distinct brownish discoloration along the edge of his right cuff, iron mold, I suspect, combined with slight abrasions on his thumb and forefinger. Our Mr. Blackwell has been opening containers that have long been sealed, probably stored in damp conditions. Family documents, perhaps, or personal effects retrieved from some cellar repository. The death of his brother has driven him to examine the past with considerable urgency." Before I could respond, our cab drew to a halt before number 16, an imposing four-story townhouse whose sober facade spoke of wealth and respectability. We were met at the entrance not by Edmund Blackwell, but by the familiar, sharp-featured countenance of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. The official detective's expression combined relief at our arrival with his customary skepticism regarding Holmes's methods. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade greeted us with a curt nod. "I rather expected you might turn up. Mr. Edmund Blackwell has been most insistent about his theories, though I fear he's wasting your time. This is as straightforward a case of natural death as I've encountered in 20 years of police work." Indeed, Holmes handed his coat to a pale, nervous footman. "And the locked door, the cryptic note, these strike you as typical symptoms of cardiac arrest, Lestrade?" "The door was locked because Sir Charles valued his privacy. Nothing unusual in that. As for the note, we believe it was placed there earlier, perhaps by someone with a grudge, and the shock of discovering it may well have precipitated the old gentleman's heart failure. Cruel, certainly, but hardly murder." Holmes's thin smile suggested he found this explanation less than satisfying. "A theory that relies heavily upon coincidence, Inspector. I should very much like to examine the scene myself." The study occupied the rear of the house, accessible through a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. A uniformed constable stood guard outside the heavy oak door, straightening to attention as we approached. The room beyond was a gentleman's sanctuary of the traditional sort. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes, and heavy furniture that spoke of comfort and permanence. Holmes paused just inside the threshold, his gaze sweeping the chamber with that peculiar intensity that never failed to impress me. For a full minute he stood motionless, absorbing every detail, every angle, before stepping carefully into the room. The air held the lingering scent of tobacco, leather, and beeswax, overlaid with the faint, oppressive atmosphere that seems to cling to places where violent death has occurred. "The body has been removed to the mortuary?" Holmes inquired, moving toward the substantial mahogany desk that dominated the space before tall windows overlooking a small private garden. "Yesterday evening," Edmund Blackwell confirmed, entering behind us. "But I can describe his position exactly. Charles sat in that chair behind the desk, perfectly upright, his hands resting naturally, one upon a half-written letter, the other in his lap. His eyes were closed, and save for a certain pallor and the complete stillness, one might have thought him merely dozing over his correspondence." Holmes circled the desk with methodical precision, occasionally dropping to his knees to examine the Persian carpet or rising to inspect the upper shelves of the bookcases. He produced his magnifying lens and scrutinized the desktop with minute attention, then turned his focus to the windows. "These fastenings show no signs of recent disturbance," he observed, running his finger along the window catch. "Note the accumulation of paint and dust in the mechanism, Lestrade. They could not have been opened and reclosed without leaving obvious traces." He tested the latch carefully. "Yet there is something curious here. A faint smear of fresh oil on the metal. And if I am not mistaken—" He breathed lightly upon the glass pane, revealing a barely visible impression. "Someone has recently pressed against this window, looking out into the night." "Impossible," Lestrade protested. "I examined those latches myself. They're solid as a rock." "Fastened, certainly," Holmes murmured, his eyes narrowing as he peered through the fog-shrouded glass into the garden below. "But the question of security is rather more complex than mere mechanical fastening." He moved next to the fireplace, a modest affair with a marble surround, and peered up the chimney with his lens. Too narrow for human passage, and the soot undisturbed for months. However, he knelt beside the grate, stirring the cold ashes with the poker. "This fire presents several points of interest. You will observe that the coal scuttle stands to the left of the hearth, yet the larger lumps were placed on the right side of the grate, an awkward arrangement for a right-handed person. Moreover, there is this." Using a pair of tweezers, he extracted a partially burned fragment from among the ashes. Not newspaper, but heavy, cream-colored paper of expensive quality. "Watson, your medical opinion," Holmes continued, rising and brushing ash from his knees. "Could a man die of sudden heart failure and remain sitting perfectly upright in his chair for several hours?" I considered the question carefully, drawing upon my years of medical experience. "It would be most unusual, Holmes. While sudden cardiac death can occur, the body typically slumps forward or to one side as the muscles relax. To remain sitting as naturally as if alive suggests either an extraordinarily rapid onset of rigor mortis, which would require specific conditions, or that someone arranged the body after death." "Precisely my conclusion. Yet therein lies our central puzzle. How did this hypothetical someone enter a room locked from the inside, commit murder without leaving any trace of violence or obvious poison, arrange the body with meticulous care, plant the threatening note, and depart again, all while leaving every entrance apparently secure?" Holmes returned to the desk and examined its surface with renewed intensity. Near the dead man's customary position, he paused, pointing to an almost invisible circular impression in the green baize covering. "Observe this mark, Watson, no larger than a shilling, with traces of white powder within." He scraped a minute sample onto his fingernail and examined it closely. "Tailor's chalk, unless I am very much mistaken, an odd substance to find on a gentleman's desk, particularly one who employed a valet for all his sartorial needs." "What could it signify?" I asked. "Several possibilities present themselves. It might indicate the presence of someone whose profession requires such materials, or perhaps someone disguised as a tradesman. The position suggests it was left by someone leaning across the desk, someone who stood where we now stand." Lestrade, who had been growing increasingly restless during this examination, stepped forward impatiently. "Really, Holmes, you're building castles in the air. A bit of chalk, some oil on a window latch. These are hardly evidence of murder." "The man died of natural causes, as Dr. Langley determined. The post-mortem examination found no trace of poison or violence." "Ah, but was a complete post-mortem actually performed?" Holmes inquired mildly. "Or merely a superficial examination by a police surgeon eager to close an apparently straightforward case?" Edmund Blackwell's face darkened. Dr. Langley made only a cursory inspection. When I pressed him about the possibility of exotic poisons, he dismissed my concerns without proper investigation. He seemed more interested in completing his paperwork than in determining the true cause of death. Holmes nodded grimly. "Professional complacency, Watson, one of the great curses of our age. Tell me, Mr. Blackwell, I require precise details regarding every person who had access to this house on the night of your brother's death. We must establish not only opportunity, but also the exact sequence of events that led to Sir Charles being discovered in such an impossibly natural pose." As our client began his careful recitation, interrupted occasionally by Holmes's sharp, probing questions, I found myself studying the room with new eyes. The oppressive atmosphere I had noted upon entering seemed to intensify, as though the very walls held secrets that refused to yield to ordinary investigation. Whatever had transpired here 3 nights ago, I was certain it was far more complex and sinister than Inspector Lestrade's simple theory of natural death could possibly encompass. The game, as Holmes would say, was indeed afoot, and I suspected we were dealing with an adversary whose cunning and patience might prove worthy of my friend's remarkable talents. The drawing room of the Blackwell residence had been transformed into an impromptu interrogation chamber, with Holmes positioned strategically near the fireplace, where he could observe each servant's demeanor as they recounted their memories of that fateful evening. The assembled staff presented a study in nervous apprehension. 5 individuals whose quiet, orderly world had been shattered by their master's inexplicable death. Graves stood with the rigid dignity befitting his 20 years of faithful service, though the lines etched deeply around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights since the discovery. Mrs. Pemberton, the cook, twisted her apron between work-roughened hands, while the 2 housemaids, Emily and Sarah, huddled together like frightened sparrows. Thomas, the footman, maintained an uncomfortable silence near the doorway, his usual composure clearly strained. "I require complete honesty from each of you," Holmes began, his penetrating gaze moving methodically from face to face. "The smallest detail you might consider insignificant could prove crucial to our understanding of what transpired in this house 3 nights ago." He turned first to Graves, whose testimony would establish the foundation for all subsequent questioning. "You discovered Sir Charles on the morning of November 8th. I want you to describe precisely what you observed, omitting nothing." The butler drew himself up with evident relief at having his account taken seriously after Lestrade's perfunctory questioning. "I entered the study at 8 o'clock, as was my custom, sir. The door was locked, which was not entirely unusual. Sir Charles often secured himself when working late into the evening. I knocked twice, received no answer, and used my duplicate key to enter." Holmes's eyes sharpened immediately. "You possess a duplicate key? Where is this key normally kept?" "In my pantry, sir, hanging on a hook behind the preserves. It is for emergencies only, and I can assure you it had not been disturbed. The dust around the hook was undisturbed, and only I know of its location." "Continue with your discovery." Graves' voice grew steadier as he recounted the familiar details. "Sir Charles sat at his desk exactly as I had left him the previous evening, save for one crucial difference. He was now fully dressed in his coat and waistcoat. His eyes were closed, his hands positioned naturally upon the desktop, and at first glance I thought he had merely fallen asleep over his correspondence. But when I approached and spoke his name—" The butler's composure faltered slightly. There was no response. His skin was cold to the touch, and I knew immediately that he had passed during the night. Holmes began pacing before the fireplace, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose I had learned to associate with intense concentration. "You mentioned that Sir Charles was fully dressed when you found him. Yet the previous evening, when you delivered his warm milk at 10:30, he had removed his coat and waistcoat. You are absolutely certain of this detail?" "Completely certain, sir. They hung over the back of his chair, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up slightly, a habit of his when dealing with correspondence. I remember thinking the study was rather chilly, and wondering that he should work in such attire. Yet in the morning he was impeccably dressed. Did you notice anything else unusual about his appearance or the condition of the room?" Graves considered carefully, his brow furrowed with the effort of precise recollection. "Several things struck me as odd, sir. The lamp on his desk had burned out. The oil reservoir was completely empty. The fire had died to cold ashes, though I had seen it burning brightly when I brought the milk, and there was a peculiar odor in the air, faint but distinctive. Rather sweet, almost like almonds, though not quite the same." I saw Holmes's eyes flash with sudden, intense interest, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Almonds, you say? How long did this scent persist?" "Only a few minutes, sir. By the time Dr. Langley arrived, I could no longer detect it. I thought perhaps it came from something Sir Charles had been eating, though he rarely took food in his study." Holmes turned his attention to Mrs. Pemberton, who had been following the conversation with growing anxiety. "You prepared Sir Charles's evening meal and the warm milk that Graves delivered. Tell me precisely what he consumed." "Roast lamb, sir, with roasted potatoes and fresh vegetables from our garden, a simple custard for dessert, flavored with vanilla, all from the same dishes served to the staff. I can assure you there was nothing amiss with the food. The warm milk was prepared by my own hands, with just a touch of honey, as Sir Charles preferred. I watched Graves carry it to the study myself." Holmes nodded slowly, then addressed the younger servants with renewed intensity. "Emily, Sarah, did either of you notice anything unusual that evening? Any visitors? Strange sounds? Unfamiliar faces in the square or surrounding streets?" The two housemaids exchanged nervous glances before Emily, the elder of the pair, spoke hesitantly. "There was something, sir, though I didn't think to mention it to the inspector. Around midnight, I was delayed in my duties and was closing the curtains in the upper hallway when I saw a figure in the garden. Just a shadow, really, moving near the wall that separates our property from the mews behind." "A shadow," Holmes repeated, his voice sharpening with interest. "Could you determine anything about this person's size, build, or manner of dress?" "It was too dark, sir, and the fog was terribly thick. I only glimpsed them for a moment before they disappeared entirely. I thought perhaps it was a stray cat, or my imagination playing tricks in the mist." "Yet you remember it clearly enough to mention it now." Emily flushed. "It gave me a queer feeling, sir, like being watched, though I cannot say why." Holmes made a mental note before continuing his systematic questioning. "Graves, I require precise details regarding any visitors Sir Charles received in the days preceding his death. Had he mentioned expecting anyone, or did anyone call whom you considered unusual?" The butler's expression grew troubled. "There was one caller, sir, 3 days before Sir Charles's death. A gentleman who gave no card but claimed to have urgent business regarding Sir Charles's time in India. Sir Charles received him in the study for perhaps 20 minutes. When the gentleman departed, Sir Charles seemed quite agitated, more disturbed than I had seen him in years. He spent the remainder of that day and the next going through old papers in the library, muttering to himself, and appearing increasingly troubled." "Can you describe this visitor in detail?" "Middle-aged, well-dressed, with a distinctly military bearing. Dark hair graying at the temples, a neatly trimmed beard, and piercing dark eyes. He carried a walking stick with an unusual handle, carved in the shape of a serpent's head, quite distinctive. His accent suggested education, though there was something foreign in his pronunciation of certain words." Holmes's expression remained carefully neutral, but I detected the gleam of satisfaction that indicated a significant piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. "Did this gentleman arrive on foot or by carriage?" He walked, sir, approaching from the direction of the square. I noticed because most visitors of his apparent station arrive by cab or private conveyance. He seemed to know the neighborhood well, moving with confidence despite the fog. One final question for all of you, Holmes continued, his tone becoming more urgent. Has anyone noticed whether anything is missing from the house? Any item, however small, that was present before Sir Charles's death, but has since disappeared? The servants exchanged uncertain glances before Mrs. Pemberton spoke up. I cannot say for certain, sir, but I believe there was a small brass figurine on the mantelpiece in the study, an Indian deity of some sort, with multiple arms and an elaborate headdress. I dusted it regularly, but I haven't seen it since Sir Charles's death. Holmes immediately moved to the study mantelpiece, examining the faint outline in the accumulated dust where an object had recently stood. Approximately 6 inches tall, would you estimate? Yes, sir. Sir Charles was quite fond of it, claimed it brought him luck during his years in Bombay. He often touched it when deep in thought. Luck, Holmes murmured, can prove remarkably fickle. He paused, then addressed the group with sudden decisiveness. You have all been most helpful. However, I must ask that none of you discuss this conversation with anyone outside this household. If any of you recall additional details, no matter how trivial they may seem, you are to contact me immediately at Baker Street. As the servants filed out, Edmund Blackwell approached with barely contained anxiety. Mr. Holmes, these revelations, do they suggest a direction for your investigation? Before Holmes could respond, Graves cleared his throat apologetically. If I may, sir, there is one additional matter. It concerns Sir Charles's nephew, Mr. Arthur Fenwick. Edmund Blackwell's expression darkened immediately. Arthur? What has that wastrel to do with this? Well, sir, Graves continued reluctantly, there was the matter of their quarrel, just 2 days before Sir Charles's death. Mr. Arthur came here in a terrible state, demanding money to settle gambling debts. When Sir Charles refused, he had grown tired of paying off Arthur's creditors. The young man flew into a rage. I could hear them shouting from the hallway. Master Arthur cried out that he was being cheated of his birthright, and his exact words, if I recall correctly, were, "If you won't give me what is mine, I shall find a way to collect it myself." Lestrade, who had been growing increasingly restless during the lengthy interrogation, suddenly perked up, with the enthusiasm of a terrier scenting prey. The note! The debt has been collected. It fits perfectly. Tell me, Graves, does this nephew have a key to the house? He did, sir. Sir Charles demanded it back during their quarrel, but I cannot say for certain if Mr. Arthur actually surrendered it. He made a great show of throwing a key onto the desk, but... Graves hesitated, clearly reluctant to speak ill of family. But what? Holmes pressed gently. Well, sir, Mr. Arthur is a man of sleight of hand, one might say. He works as a costumier for the Pantheon Theatre, designing wardrobes and managing stage properties. He is quite skilled with his hands when he chooses to apply himself. A heavy silence fell upon the room, broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I saw Holmes's expression grow thoughtful, while Lestrade practically vibrated with excitement. A costumier, the inspector repeated, looking significantly at Holmes. A man who works with fabric and stage properties, and undoubtedly with tailor's chalk. The very substance you found on the desk, Mr. Holmes. He has motive, opportunity, if he kept the key, and he left his calling card right there on the green baize. Holmes remained silent for a long moment, his keen eyes studying the faces around him. Where does Mr. Fenwick reside? He asked finally. He has lodgings in Soho, sir, Graves replied. Greek Street, above Murphy's Bakery. Then we shall pay him a call, Lestrade declared, already reaching for his hat with the fervor of a man who believes his work is nearly complete. I'll wager we find he's unable to account for his movements on the night in question. Yet even as we prepared to depart for Soho, I noticed that Holmes's expression remained troubled, his brilliant mind clearly wrestling with aspects of the case that did not align with this seemingly obvious solution. The systematic gathering of evidence had revealed a complex web of connections. The mysterious visitor with his serpent-headed cane, the missing Indian figurine, the impossible circumstances of the death itself, and now a conveniently obvious suspect whose very convenience seemed to trouble my friend's analytical nature. As we descended into the fog-shrouded streets of London, I could not shake the feeling that we were being led down a carefully prepared path, guided by an intelligence that had anticipated our every move and prepared for our every deduction. The game, as Holmes would say, was indeed becoming more intricate with each revelation. The hansom rattled eastward through the labyrinthine streets that separate the refined squares of Belgravia from the more bohemian quarters of Soho, our wheels clattering rhythmically against cobblestones slick with moisture from the persistent fog. The mist had thickened again as afternoon wore toward evening, transforming familiar landmarks into ghostly suggestions and muffling the usual cacophony of London traffic into a series of distant, dreamlike sounds. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his hawk-like profile occasionally illuminated by the amber glow of passing gas lamps, while Inspector Lestrade fairly vibrated with suppressed excitement across from us. The official detective's satisfaction was palpable, radiating from him like heat from a well-stoked fire. "A neat case indeed, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade observed at length, unable to contain his triumph any longer. "I'll grant you your mysterious chalk marks and window smears, theatrical flourishes, perhaps, but the central matter is as clear as daylight. The nephew drowns in gambling debts, quarrels violently with his only benefactor, threatens to collect what he believes is owed, and 2 days later the old gentleman is found dead with a note declaring the debt collected. If that isn't motive, means, and opportunity served up on a silver platter, I don't know what is." Holmes drew thoughtfully on his pipe, sending a thin stream of smoke toward the cab's leather roof. His gray eyes remained fixed on the swirling fog beyond the window, but I could sense the intense mental activity beneath his apparently relaxed demeanor. "Your logic would be more compelling, Lestrade," he replied at length, "if it addressed the fundamental impossibility of the crime itself. You provide motive in abundance, some degree of opportunity, and even your cherished written confession. But unless Mr. Fenwick has discovered a method of committing murder in locked rooms while leaving no trace of violence or poison, we must still regard the mechanics of death as entirely unresolved." "Methods can be discovered once we've laid hands on the man," Lestrade countered with characteristic confidence. "Find the fellow with the strongest reason to wish the victim dead, then see how the pieces fit together. Mark my words, young Fenwick will crack under proper questioning." Holmes's thin lips curved in a faint, sardonic smile. "You remind me of a physician who diagnoses every ailment as indigestion until proven otherwise. Pray do not let your natural desire for a swift arrest blind you to the peculiarities that make this case unique among my experience." We turned into Greek Street, where respectable establishments, tailors, bookshops, coffee houses, alternated with the more dubious enterprises that catered to London's nocturnal appetites. The contrast was stark, even in the fog. Well-maintained shop fronts giving way to narrow alleys and doorways that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Murphy's Bakery provided a welcome beacon of domesticity, its windows glowing warmly and displaying an array of fresh loaves and pastries that spoke of honest commerce and simple pleasures. Above the bakery, a narrow door led to the lodgings Graves had described. Lestrade's knock was answered by a woman whose careworn features and suspicious manner suggested long experience with the sort of tenants who attracted official attention. "Mr. Arthur Fenwick?" Lestrade inquired, displaying his warrant card with practiced efficiency. "Top floor back," she replied reluctantly, "though I can't say he's in a fit state for visitors. Been pacing about all morning, muttering to himself like a man with troubles on his mind. I don't want any disturbance in my house, Inspector. I run a respectable establishment." "Your cooperation is noted, madam," Holmes said smoothly, stepping past her with a courtesy that did not disguise his determination. "We shall be as brief as circumstances permit." The narrow staircase creaked ominously under our combined weight, and the air grew thick with the mingled odors of cooking, tobacco, and something faintly chemical that I could not immediately identify. At the top landing, Lestrade's authoritative rap brought an immediate response. The sound of hurried movement within, followed by what might have been the closing of a drawer or cupboard. The door opened to reveal a young man whose appearance perfectly embodied the romantic ideal of the struggling artist, though closer inspection revealed the telltale signs of dissipation and anxiety. Arthur Fenwick possessed the dark, curling hair and fine features that would have served him well on the stage, but his eyes held the reddened quality of recent drink, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the doorframe. "Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard," the detective announced, pushing past him into the cramped lodgings. "These gentlemen are Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. We are here to discuss your whereabouts on the evening of November 7th. The apartment was a fascinating study in controlled chaos. Theatrical costumes hung from every available surface. Military uniforms, evening dress, exotic foreign garments that might have graced any stage in London. A substantial work table dominated the main room, its surface covered with fabric samples, sketching materials, needles, thread, and several sticks of tailor's chalk in various colors. The walls were lined with sketches of costume designs, many showing remarkable artistic skill despite their hurried execution. Holmes moved immediately to the work table, his keen eyes scanning its contents with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize as the prelude to significant discovery. He picked up one of the chalk sticks, examined it closely with his magnifying lens, then set it down with an expression that revealed nothing of his conclusions. "Mr. Fenwick," Holmes began, his tone deceptively conversational, "I understand you had a rather heated disagreement with your uncle shortly before his death. Perhaps you would care to explain the nature of that quarrel." Fenwick's theatrical composure slipped visibly, replaced by a mixture of defiance and genuine distress. "I see the servants have been gossiping. Yes, I asked Uncle Charles for money, a loan, nothing more. A perfectly reasonable request from his only living relative and heir. He refused, as he always did, delivering his usual sanctimonious lecture about earning one's way through honest labor." His voice grew bitter, rather hypocritical, coming from a man who made his fortune through decidedly questionable dealings in India 30 years ago. "You threatened him," Lestrade interjected sharply. "Witnesses heard you declare you would collect what was owed to you." "Words spoken in anger, Inspector, nothing more. I was frustrated, certainly, but hardly murderous. Besides, what would be the point? Uncle Charles was 62, but in excellent health. I stood to inherit everything eventually. Why would I risk the gallows by hastening matters unnecessarily?" Holmes had moved to examine the military uniform hanging near the window, an authentic piece from the Indian Army, circa 1865, its brass buttons tarnished with age, but still bearing the regimental insignia. "Tell me, Mr. Fenwick, where were you on the evening of November 7th, between the hours of 10 o'clock and midnight?" "Here, in these very lodgings, working on costumes for a production of The Tempest that opens next week at the Pantheon Theater. I worked until well past midnight. My landlady can attest to the noise I was making when I finally retired." "And witnesses to corroborate this?" Fenwick's shoulders sagged slightly. "Unfortunately, no. I work alone, Inspector. The theatrical profession is not conducive to maintaining conventional social arrangements or regular hours." Holmes continued his methodical examination of the room, pausing before a curtained alcove near the rear wall. Something in Fenwick's manner, a nervous glance, a slight tensing of his shoulders, drew my friend's attention like a magnet draws iron filings. "You seem remarkably well informed about the circumstances of your uncle's death," Holmes observed, his hand resting on the curtain. "The newspapers mentioned only his passing, without specifying the official cause." For the first time, genuine alarm flickered across Fenwick's features. I assumed, given his age and the lack of any mention of violence." "Assumptions can prove dangerous," Holmes murmured, then drew back the curtain with a swift, decisive motion. What lay revealed behind the heavy fabric caused us all to draw breath sharply. On a small table, carefully arranged as if for some ceremonial purpose, stood the missing Indian figurine, the multi-armed deity Mrs. Pemberton had described. But it was not alone. Beside it sat a partially burned candle of black wax, a small brass bowl containing what appeared to be dried herbs, and most tellingly, an open book whose pages were covered with arcane symbols and text in what looked like Sanskrit. "Explain this, Holmes," commanded, his voice cutting through Fenwick's stammered protests like a blade through silk. The young man collapsed onto a nearby divan, burying his face in his hands. I took it, the day of our argument. When Uncle Charles turned his back to unlock his safe, I slipped the figurine into my pocket. It was petty, I know, a childish act of spite. I thought I might pawn it for a few guineas to tide me over. And the rest of this arrangement?" Fenwick looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was desperate, Mr. Holmes. My creditors were threatening violence. My career was stagnating, and Uncle Charles had cut me off completely. A friend in the theatrical community mentioned certain rituals that might change one's fortune. I know it sounds foolish, but I was willing to try anything." Lestrade seized upon this admission with grim satisfaction. "So you admit to theft, to being present in the house, and to practicing dark arts. This looks very bad for you, Fenwick. Very bad indeed." "I didn't kill him," Fenwick cried, genuine anguish in his voice. "I stole the statue, yes. I threatened him in anger, yes. But I never returned to that house. I was here all night, burning candles and chanting nonsense from a book I barely understood." Holmes lifted the black candle to his nose, inhaling delicately. "Beeswax mixed with datura, I believe. A potent combination. Where did you acquire these materials, Mr. Fenwick?" "A shop near the Thames called the Golden Lotus. They specialize in curiosities, theatrical props, things of that nature. The proprietor said the candle would help focus my intentions." "And this book of rituals?" Fenwick hesitated, then gestured helplessly toward a wastebasket in the corner. "It was sent to me, anonymously, about a week ago. A package arrived with the book and a note saying it might help with my financial difficulties." Holmes immediately retrieved the crumpled wrapping paper and envelope, smoothing them out on the work table with infinite care. His examination with the magnifying lens was thorough and methodical. "Block capitals," he observed quietly. "Common brown paper, standard envelope, but the postmark is quite specific. Southwark, dated 3 days before your visit to your uncle." He turned to me, his expression grave with sudden understanding. "Watson, observe the pattern emerging here. Someone provided Mr. Fenwick with both the means and the motivation to dabble in matters he did not understand, at precisely the moment his conflict with his uncle reached its crisis point." "You mean he was deliberately set up?" I asked, astonished by the implications. "I mean," Holmes replied with quiet intensity, "that our theatrical friend here may be merely a puppet in a much larger and more sophisticated production. Someone wanted Arthur Fenwick to appear guilty. They knew of his debts, his temperament, his profession, even his strained relationship with his uncle. They provided him with suspicious materials and ensured he would have both motive and apparent opportunity." Lestrade looked from the incriminating evidence to the weeping young man, his earlier certainty beginning to waver. "But the theft, the threats, the tailor's chalk found on the desk. Motive and opportunity are common enough, Holmes countered. But a frame of this complexity and precision requires a mastermind, someone who knew the Blackwell family intimately, understood the layout of the house, and possessed the patience to manipulate a desperate young man over an extended period. He turned back to Fenwick with renewed intensity. One final question. The gentleman who visited your uncle 3 days before his death, the man with the serpent-headed walking stick. Have you ever encountered such a person? Fenwick looked genuinely puzzled. I know no one fitting that description. Uncle Charles had few visitors, and I was hardly welcome in his social circle. Holmes straightened, his decision clearly made. Lestrade, you must follow your conscience in this matter, but I strongly advise against charging this man with murder based on the evidence we have seen. Hold him for theft of the figurine if you must, but keep an open mind regarding the capital charge. I am now convinced that the true author of this crime is still at large, probably congratulating himself on the success of his elaborate deception. As we prepared to leave the cramped lodgings, Holmes paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. Mr. Fenwick, you have been used as a tool by someone far more clever and ruthless than yourself. Your best hope lies in complete honesty with the authorities and in trusting that the truth will ultimately prevail over appearances. The fog had thickened to an almost impenetrable wall by the time we reached the street, transforming the familiar world into something alien and threatening. Holmes strode purposefully through the murk, his mind clearly racing ahead to the next phase of our investigation. Where to now? I asked, struggling to match his rapid pace. First to the British Museum, Watson, he replied, his eyes gleaming with the fierce joy of intellectual pursuit. I require certain references regarding Indian military history and the religious symbolism of serpent deities. Then we must locate this Golden Lotus establishment near the Thames. I have a strong suspicion that shop holds keys to unlocking this entire mystery. As we disappeared into the London fog, I could not shake the feeling that we had just witnessed the first act of a drama whose true scope and complexity were only beginning to reveal themselves. The obvious suspect had been found and examined, but for Sherlock Holmes the investigation was entering its most dangerous and intriguing phase. The game, as he would say, was indeed afoot, and our adversary was proving worthy of my friend's formidable talents. The November evening had drawn its dark curtain across London by the time our hansom deposited us before the imposing facade of the British Museum. The fog had thickened considerably since our departure from Soho, transforming the great institution into a ghostly monument that loomed through the mist like some ancient temple dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. Holmes moved with purposeful strides through the echoing corridors, his mind clearly focused on the specific information he sought among the vast collections housed within these hallowed walls. The Temple of Knowledge, the Oriental Reading Room, provided sanctuary from both the fog and the growing complexity of our case. Holmes had requested several substantial volumes before we were even seated, works dealing with the Indian Mutiny of 1857, regimental histories of the Bengal Army, and what appeared to be scholarly treatises on various religious movements that had flourished during Britain's expansion across the subcontinent. His approach was characteristically methodical, each book selected with the precision of a surgeon choosing his instruments. You will observe, Watson, he murmured as he opened the first volume, that when confronting a crime whose roots may stretch back decades and half a world away, one must first illuminate that distant landscape. We have established connections between Sir Charles Blackwell and Colonel Weatherby through their shared service in India. Now we must discover what events during that period might inspire such elaborate and patient revenge. For the better part of an hour, Holmes immersed himself in these dusty records, occasionally making notes in his peculiar shorthand, or pausing to examine detailed illustrations with his magnifying lens. I watched as his expression grew increasingly thoughtful, that familiar gleam of intellectual satisfaction beginning to kindle in his gray eyes. Most illuminating indeed, he finally observed, turning one of the volumes so I might see a particular illustration. The image depicted a gathering of robed figures surrounding an altar bearing a multi-armed deity remarkably similar to the figurine we had discovered in Arthur Fenwick's lodgings. Serpent motifs were woven throughout the ceremonial scene, coiling around pillars and incorporated into the participants' ritual garments. The Brotherhood of the Naga, Holmes explained, his finger tracing the detailed caption. A secret society that emerged in Bengal around 1860, composed primarily of native merchants and minor nobility who had suffered financial ruin during the mutiny and its aftermath. They were particularly noted for their patient pursuit of those they held responsible for their misfortunes and for their knowledge of indigenous poisons that left few traces detectable by Western medical examination. Serpents and debts. Holmes continued his research with renewed intensity, cross-referencing regimental records with accounts of various commercial scandals that had marked the period of British expansion. Within another quarter hour, he had assembled a compelling narrative of greed, betrayal, and the seeds of long-delayed vengeance. Here we find mention of Barrington and Blackwell, a trading house implicated in fraudulent land acquisitions near Calcutta, he observed, indicating a passage in one of the military histories. The matter was officially suppressed, but the informed reader will recognize our late Sir Charles in this partnership. And observe this supplementary record. Captain Henry Weatherby served as military liaison to the district administration during precisely the same period. Both men profited handsomely from transactions that left numerous native families destitute. The pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. Holmes made careful notes regarding specific chemical compounds mentioned in connection with the Brotherhood's activities, paying particular attention to substances derived from indigenous plants that could induce sudden cardiac arrest while leaving the victim's musculature temporarily rigid, a condition that would explain the impossibly natural seated positions in which both victims had been discovered. The sweet almond scent Graves detected in Sir Charles's study, Holmes noted with satisfaction, is entirely consistent with the presence of cyanogenic compounds in such preparations. Our killer possesses not merely the motive for revenge, but also the specialized knowledge required to execute these seemingly impossible murders. The Golden Lotus. Armed with this historical context, we departed the museum and made our way through the fog-shrouded streets toward the Thames, where Holmes sought the establishment that had supplied Arthur Fenwick with his incriminating theatrical properties. The Golden Lotus occupied a narrow shopfront in a district where respectable commerce gave way gradually to enterprises of more questionable character. The window display revealed an eclectic collection of Eastern curiosities, jade figurines, silk fabrics, brass instruments of uncertain purpose, and various bottles containing substances I preferred not to contemplate too closely. The proprietor who emerged from the shop's dim interior was a man of indeterminate age and mixed heritage, his features suggesting both European and Asian bloodlines. He greeted us with professional courtesy, though I detected a wariness in his manner that suggested familiarity with customers whose motives extended beyond mere collecting. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said in cultured English that bore no trace of foreign accent. "How may I assist you this evening? Perhaps you seek something specific among my modest collection." Holmes approached the counter with that deceptive casualness that often preceded his most penetrating inquiries. "We are investigating certain matters that have brought us to your establishment," he began, producing the fragment of black candle we had recovered from Arthur Fenwick's lodgings. "I believe you recently provided this young man with specific materials, a black candle infused with datura, among other ceremonial objects. I should very much like to know who commissioned you to prepare these items." The serpent-headed cane. The proprietor's professional composure wavered slightly, revealing genuine alarm beneath his cultivated neutrality. After a moment's hesitation, and Holmes's gentle but firm insistence regarding the serious nature of our investigation, the man's resistance crumbled entirely. "The gentleman you seek visited my establishment approximately 2 weeks ago," he admitted reluctantly. He gave the name Vikram Chandra, though I suspected it was not his true identity. Military bearing, well-dressed, perhaps 50 years of age. He spoke Hindi with native fluency, yet his English bore the unmistakable marks of public school education. A man caught between two worlds, as it were. Holmes leaned forward with intense interest. And his specific requirements? He was particularly interested in items associated with the Naga tradition, ceremonial objects, historical texts, and certain traditional preparations. Most notably, he commissioned a walking stick with a serpent head handle, specifying very particular modifications to its internal structure. The proprietor produced a detailed sketch from his files, showing not merely the decorative handle, but subtle alterations to the stick's interior mechanism. Holmes examined the drawing with his magnifying lens, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "Ingenious," he murmured. "The walking stick itself serves as a delivery mechanism, Watson. Observe these hollow channels within the shaft, this concealed reservoir in the handle, these minute perforations disguised as decorative elements. A man carrying such a device could dispense poison as vapor or fine mist through simple manipulation of hidden mechanisms, all while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation." The method revealed. The implications of this discovery struck me with startling clarity. Then the locked room was never the scene of the crime itself, I realized. It was merely the stage for the final act, a theatrical flourish designed to baffle investigation. Precisely, Watson. Our killer could poison his victims during seemingly innocent encounters, with the effects delayed until they had returned to their private studies and secured themselves within. The locked doors become not obstacles to overcome, but rather guarantees that the victims would die alone and undisturbed, in positions that would suggest natural causes to cursory examination. Holmes turned back to the proprietor with renewed urgency. "Did this Mr. Chandra mention any other names? Any indication of additional targets for his attention?" The man consulted his records with trembling hands. "He inquired about the current whereabouts of several other gentlemen, a Major Thornton and a Mr. Edmund Blackwell among them. I assumed he was merely seeking old acquaintances, but given what you have told me—" Holmes and I exchanged alarmed glances. Edmund Blackwell, our client who had first brought this case to our attention, might well be the next target of this methodical killer. The pattern was becoming terrifyingly clear, a systematic elimination of those responsible for the Brotherhood's destruction, executed with patience, precision, and a diabolical understanding of both chemistry and human psychology. The tightening noose. As we prepared to leave the shop, Holmes paused to examine once more the partially burned fragment he had recovered from Sir Charles's fireplace. In the improved light of the street lamp outside, additional details became visible. The faint impression of a circular design that had been troubling his analytical mind. "This fragment bears the ghost of a postage stamp, Watson," he observed with quiet satisfaction. "Someone burned an envelope in Sir Charles's grate, but preserved its contents. The threatening note was not placed in his pocket after death. It was delivered by post, probably the evening before, or earlier that same day. Sir Charles received advance warning of his fate, which explains his agitated state during his final hours. The implications were chilling. Our adversary had not merely committed murder, he had tormented his victims with foreknowledge of their doom, allowing them to contemplate their approaching fate while remaining powerless to prevent it. The psychological cruelty of such methods spoke to a mind consumed by hatred and bent on extracting the maximum suffering from each act of revenge. "We must warn Edmund Blackwell immediately," I urged, but Holmes was already signaling for a hansom. "Indeed, Watson, and we must do so with all possible speed. Our killer has demonstrated remarkable boldness in his operations, and I fear the accelerating pace of events suggests he is approaching the climax of his long-planned campaign. The game has entered its most dangerous phase, and we must be prepared for any eventuality." As our cab disappeared into the fog-shrouded labyrinth of London streets, I could not escape the feeling that we were racing against time itself. Somewhere in the swirling mist, a man with a serpent-headed walking stick moved with deadly purpose, confident in his elaborate preparations and perhaps already stalking his next victim. The hunt had become a race, and the stakes could not have been higher. The shadow of the Brotherhood of the Naga had followed its enemies halfway around the world and 30 years into the future. Now, in the gaslit streets of Victorian London, that ancient debt was being collected with compound interest, and Sherlock Holmes stood as the only barrier between a patient killer and the completion of his terrible work. The fog had transformed London into an alien landscape by the time our hansom clattered through the darkened streets toward Edmund Blackwell's Kensington residence. Holmes sat rigid with tension, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the amber glow of passing street lamps as they struggled to penetrate the oppressive murk. The discoveries at the British Museum and the Golden Lotus had crystallized our understanding of the case into a terrifying race against time. "We are dealing with a methodical killer, Watson," Holmes observed, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "First Colonel Weatherby, then Sir Charles, and now the pattern demands Edmund Blackwell's death to complete this systematic revenge. Our adversary has demonstrated remarkable patience in his preparations. We must assume he has already set his final trap in motion." The critical discovery. We arrived to find the Kensington townhouse shrouded in an ominous darkness, save for a single light burning in what appeared to be the ground floor study. Our frantic hammering upon the door was eventually answered by a startled footman, whose pale features immediately confirmed Holmes's worst fears. "Mr. Blackwell received a visitor earlier this evening," the servant stammered, as Holmes pushed past him into the entrance hall. "A gentleman with a military bearing who carried a distinctive walking stick. Master has been locked in his study since then, and when I brought his evening tea an hour ago, there was no response to my knocking." Holmes was already racing down the corridor, his movements swift and decisive despite the evident danger. The study door was indeed locked from within, just as Sir Charles's had been. Without hesitation, Holmes threw his shoulder against the heavy oak panels, and with our combined weight, the lock splintered with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent house. The scene that greeted us was chillingly familiar, yet crucially different. Edmund Blackwell sat slumped in his leather armchair by the dying fire, his posture rigid and his breathing shallow, but unmistakably present. Unlike his brother, we had arrived in time. Barely, but sufficient to make the difference between life and death. Medical intervention and investigation. I rushed immediately to his side, my medical training overriding all other considerations. His pulse fluttered weakly beneath my fingertips, his pupils were dilated, and the faint but distinctive scent of almonds hung in the air around him. "He lives, Holmes, but the symptoms are consistent with cyanide poisoning, the same compounds you identified in your research. However, the dose appears incomplete or interrupted." While I administered emergency treatment, loosening his collar, forcing brandy and water down his throat to dilute the poison, and stimulating his circulation, Holmes conducted his methodical examination of the room. His movements were swift but thorough, missing nothing in his systematic search for evidence of the killer's presence and methods. "The windows, Watson," Holmes announced, moving to examine the fastenings with his magnifying lens. "Locked from within, as before, but observe these minute scratches around the edge of the glass pane and this faint residue on the exterior surface." He traced barely visible marks with his finger. "Most ingenious. The walking stick's serpent head was designed as a precision instrument. When pressed against the window with sufficient force, it created an airtight seal, allowing poisonous vapor to be forced through microscopic channels deliberately created in the glass itself." The method revealed. The implications struck me with startling clarity. Then the locked room was never truly secure, I realized. The killer could approach from the garden, apply his deadly apparatus to any window, and deliver his poison without ever entering the house. Precisely, Watson. No lock, no guard, no precaution could protect against such methods. Our adversary has demonstrated not merely patience and knowledge of exotic poisons, but also remarkable technical ingenuity in their application. As my treatment began to take effect, Edmund Blackwell's eyelids fluttered weakly, and his lips moved as though attempting speech. I leaned close, straining to catch whatever words he might manage in his extremity. "Serpent," he whispered, the word emerging as barely more than an exhalation. "Walking stick, pressed against window. Saw him through the glass." His voice grew slightly stronger with effort. "Military bearing. Recognized him from Charles's description. Claimed to represent those we wronged in India." Holmes was at my side instantly, his face alight with fierce concentration. "Did he give a name, Mr. Blackwell? Any indication of his current identity or whereabouts?" "Chandra," Blackwell managed, his breathing growing more regular as the immediate crisis passed. "Said his father, our old partner, the man we ruined. Blood debt spanning generations." "Strategic implications." Holmes straightened, his expression grave with sudden understanding. "A confession and a crucial identification," he observed quietly. "Mr. Blackwell, you have provided us with the final pieces of this deadly puzzle. Our killer sees himself not as a murderer, but as an executioner, a righteous avenger of his family's destruction." I continued monitoring our client's vital signs while Holmes examined the remainder of the room with renewed purpose. Near the fireplace, he discovered fresh ash, still warm to the touch, and extracted a partially consumed fragment of heavy paper with his tweezers. "Another threatening note, burned after delivery," he confirmed. "The same pattern as before, psychological torment preceding physical attack. Our adversary derives satisfaction not merely from the kill, but from allowing his victims time to contemplate their approaching doom." The larger pattern. As Blackwell's condition stabilized under my care, Holmes moved to the French doors that opened onto the small private garden. Even in the fog, his keen eyes detected the evidence he sought. Faint impressions in the damp earth beneath the study windows, and unmistakable marks where something heavy had been pressed against the brick wall for support. "He stood here," Holmes observed, indicating the footprints with his lamp. "The entire operation would have required no more than 2 or 3 minutes, during which time his victim sat unsuspecting at his desk. But something went wrong tonight. Perhaps a draft from the chimney disrupted the vapor concentration, or the glass channels became partially blocked. Blackwell received only a partial dose, insufficient for the killer's purposes." The implications were both encouraging and deeply troubling. We had saved Edmund Blackwell's life and discovered the method by which the impossible murders had been committed. Yet this very knowledge revealed the terrifying scope of our adversary's capabilities. No locked room, no security measure, no precaution could protect against an enemy who could deliver death through the very walls that were meant to provide sanctuary. The next phase. "Watson," Holmes said with quiet intensity, as we prepared to summon additional medical assistance for our client. "We have solved the mystery of method and motive, but our adversary remains at large with both the means and the determination to continue his campaign. Major Thornton was mentioned as another potential target. We must locate him immediately and provide adequate protection." As Edmund Blackwell's breathing grew stronger and more regular, I reflected on the extraordinary nature of our discovery. We had witnessed an attempt at the perfect crime, murder committed from outside locked rooms, using methods that left no obvious trace and created the appearance of natural death. Only Holmes's systematic investigation and our timely arrival had prevented this final killing from joining the list of seemingly impossible crimes. "The fog is lifting slightly," Holmes observed, peering through the garden doors into the night beyond. "Perhaps that is symbolic, Watson. We have illuminated the darkness surrounding these deaths, though significant dangers remain. Our killer has been thwarted tonight, but a man who has devoted decades to planning such elaborate revenge will not abandon his mission easily. The game had indeed entered its most dangerous phase. We understood our enemy's methods, his motives, and his capabilities. Now we faced the challenge of anticipating his next move and preventing further bloodshed. Somewhere in the fog-shrouded streets of London, a man with a serpent-headed walking stick contemplated his failure and planned his next assault. The hunt had become a deadly chess match, and Sherlock Holmes was preparing to make his decisive move. The shadow of the Brotherhood of the Naga had followed its enemies across continents and decades, but it had finally encountered an opponent worthy of its cunning, and the resolution of this ancient debt would be decided in the gaslit streets of Victorian London. The clock in our Baker Street lodgings had just struck 2 when Holmes finally ceased his restless pacing and turned to me with that expression of grim determination I had learned to associate with his most dangerous enterprises. The fog outside our windows had thickened once more, transforming familiar London into an alien landscape where shadows held secrets and every footstep might herald approaching peril. "We have reached the decisive moment, Watson," he declared, his keen eyes reflecting the gaslight with unusual intensity. "Our adversary has revealed both his methods and his limitations. Chandra's failure tonight at Edmund Blackwell's residence will sting his pride and disrupt his carefully planned schedule. Such disruption breeds desperation, and desperate men make crucial errors." The strategic imperative. Holmes moved to his desk and began drafting a series of urgent communications, his pen scratching rapidly across the paper with characteristic precision. We cannot simply wait for him to strike again at a time and place of his choosing. Every moment we delay increases the danger to his remaining targets and provides him opportunity to adapt his methods or flee England entirely. No, Watson, we must force his hand, draw him into an engagement on ground of our choosing. I watched as he sealed the first telegram, addressing it to the War Office with a priority marking that would ensure immediate attention. "Major Thornton," I observed. "He is the final name mentioned by the proprietor of the Golden Lotus." Precisely. The last surviving member of that unholy triumvirate, whose actions in Bengal 30 years ago set this entire tragedy in motion. Holmes lit his pipe with steady hands, though I could sense the tension coiled within his apparently calm demeanor. If Chandra follows the psychological pattern established by his previous crimes, and fanatics are remarkably predictable in their obsessions, Thornton represents not merely another target, but the culmination of his life's work. Locating the final target. The War Office response arrived within the hour, delivered by a breathless messenger who had clearly been instructed to treat the matter with utmost urgency. Holmes tore open the official envelope with uncharacteristic haste, his eyes scanning the contents with rapid intensity. "Most illuminating," he murmured, passing me the document. "Major Alistair Thornton, formerly of the Bengal Cavalry, cashiered following the official inquiry into the Barrington and Blackwell affair. Unlike his former associates, he did not escape the consequences of his actions. His military career ended in disgrace, his social connections severed, his financial prospects destroyed. He now resides in Hampstead, living on a modest pension in circumstances far removed from his former station." The irony was not lost on either of us. While Sir Charles Blackwell and Colonel Weatherby had prospered, despite their questionable activities, Thornton had paid a heavy price for his participation in the land seizures. Yet Chandra's concept of justice appeared absolute. All who had contributed to his family's destruction must answer for their crimes, regardless of subsequent suffering or attempts at atonement. "A man who has already lost everything," I observed, "may prove either more desperate or more resigned when faced with this final threat." "We shall discover which shortly," Holmes replied, reaching for his coat. "The fog provides excellent cover for our movements, and I suspect we have little time to waste. If Chandra learns of Blackwell's survival from the morning papers, he may accelerate his plans regarding Thornton." The approach. The handsome ride through fog-shrouded London took on an almost dreamlike quality, with familiar landmarks emerging and vanishing like phantoms in the swirling mist. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his brilliant mind clearly working through the tactical considerations that would determine success or failure in the hours ahead. Major Thornton's residence in Hampstead proved to be a modest villa, whose genteel shabbiness spoke eloquently of reduced circumstances and faded glory. The man himself answered our urgent knocking personally, a telling detail that confirmed the War Office assessment of his diminished household. He was perhaps 70 years of age, still bearing traces of military bearing, despite the obvious ravages of time and disappointment. His reaction to our arrival combined weary resignation with a flicker of the old soldier's spirit. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said without surprise, stepping aside to admit us. "I have been expecting something of this nature for years. When I learned of Weatherby's death, I suspected a pattern. Charles Blackwell's passing confirmed it." The confession. In his cramped study, surrounded by military memorabilia and faded photographs of his Indian service, Major Thornton provided the final pieces of the puzzle that had driven Chandra to such elaborate revenge. His account was delivered with the stark honesty of a man who had long since abandoned any pretense of justification for his past actions. "We were young, ambitious, and utterly convinced of our own righteousness," he began, his weathered hand steady as he poured brandy for his unexpected guests. The empire was expanding, opportunities for advancement and enrichment seemed limitless, and the native population was viewed as little more than an obstacle to progress. Raghunath. Chandra was a wealthy merchant and landowner whose properties blocked certain developments we considered essential. Holmes leaned forward with intense interest. The land seizures were not legitimate? Legal, perhaps, by the narrowest technical interpretation, but hardly just. We manufactured pretexts, applied military pressure where civilian authority proved insufficient, and used our positions to ensure that appeals and protests were ignored or suppressed. Thornton's voice grew heavy with the weight of long-carried guilt. Chandra was ruined utterly, his estates confiscated, his business destroyed, his family reduced to poverty. I heard he died by his own hand not long after, unable to bear the shame of his circumstances. Setting the trap, Holmes's plan was characteristically audacious in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to guard Thornton against an unknown threat, we would use the Major as bait to draw Chandra into a carefully prepared ambush. The study would be left apparently vulnerable, with Thornton maintaining his normal evening routine, while Holmes and I positioned ourselves to intercept any attack. "You understand the risks," Holmes explained to the elderly officer. "We cannot guarantee your complete safety, though we shall take every precaution to minimize the danger. However, this may be our only opportunity to end Chandra's campaign permanently." Thornton's response reflected the courage that had once carried him through the battlefields of India. "I have faced charging cavalry and howling mutineers, Mr. Holmes. I shall not flinch from this final accounting. If payment must be made for our old sins, let it be in my presence, rather than from behind." The Vigil. As darkness fell and fog once again transformed the familiar world into something alien and threatening, we took up our assigned positions. I remained in the study with Major Thornton, ostensibly to provide medical assistance should the poison reach him despite our precautions, but in truth, serving as additional bait to maintain the appearance of normal domestic routine. Holmes positioned himself in the adjacent drawing room, from which he could observe both the garden approaches and the study interior through partially opened connecting doors. Lestrade and 2 trusted constables were concealed in the grounds, ready to close the trap once Chandra committed himself to the attack. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness, marked only by the steady ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional distant sound of traffic from the main road. The fog pressed against the windows like something alive, occasionally swirling in patterns that suggested movement where none existed. The arrival? Shortly after midnight, the quality of the silence changed in a way that set every nerve on edge. Major Thornton felt it too, his military instincts detecting the approach of danger despite the muffling fog. Through the study windows, glimpsed a dark shape materializing from the mist, tall, well-dressed, moving with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed every movement. The figure approached the French windows with confident purpose, apparently unaware that his every step was being observed. As he raised the serpent-headed walking stick and began examining the window frame for the optimal point of attack, Holmes's voice rang out with startling authority. "Mr. Vikram Chandra, I would advise you to lower that device immediately. You are surrounded, and your methods are known to us." The confrontation. The effect was electric. The killer spun toward Holmes's voice with remarkable speed, the deadly walking stick now pointed directly at the study windows. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might attempt to spray his poison through the glass, but then his shoulders straightened with what appeared to be grudging respect. "Sherlock Holmes," he said, his cultured voice carrying clearly through the fog. "I had heard you might become involved. A worthy opponent at last, though perhaps too late to save all those who deserved judgment." As Lestrade and his constables emerged from concealment, surrounding the garden with professional efficiency, I could finally see clearly the face of our adversary. He was perhaps 50 years of age, with features that spoke of mixed heritage, and eyes that held an unsettling combination of intelligence and fanatical determination. "Major Thornton," Chandra continued, his gaze fixed upon the elderly officer who stood rigid beside me. "After all these years, we meet again, though I suspect you do not remember the boy whose father you destroyed." "I remember," Thornton replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I remember all of it, and I have carried that burden every day since." The escape. What happened next unfolded with startling swiftness. As Lestrade stepped forward to make the arrest, Chandra suddenly raised the walking stick and pressed a hidden mechanism in its handle. A fine mist sprayed from the serpent's mouth, not toward us, but into the air above the constables, creating a choking cloud that sent them stumbling backward in confusion. "The Brotherhood of the Naga strikes from the shadows," he declared, his voice ringing with fanatic conviction, "and returns to them when necessary." Using the chaos he had created, Chandra vaulted the garden wall with surprising agility and disappeared into the fog-shrouded streets beyond. By the time the poisonous mist had dissipated enough for pursuit, he had vanished completely into the London night. The aftermath. "Gone," Lestrade muttered, staring into the impenetrable fog where our quarry had disappeared. "But not for long. We know his methods now, his appearance, his obsessions. He cannot hide indefinitely." Holmes stood gazing thoughtfully into the darkness, his expression troubled rather than defeated. "Perhaps not, Inspector, but a man who has devoted 30 years to planning such elaborate revenge will not abandon his mission easily. We have saved Major Thornton tonight and learned much about our adversary's capabilities. However, I fear this confrontation was merely the opening move in a larger and more dangerous game." As we prepared to escort Major Thornton to safety, Holmes turned to me with that look of grim determination I knew so well. "Watson, we have prevented one murder tonight, but Chandra remains at large with both the means and the fanatical determination to continue his campaign. The hunt is far from over. Indeed, I suspect it has only begun in earnest." The fog swirled around us as we departed the Hampstead villa, carrying with it the lingering scent of exotic poisons and the promise of further confrontations to come. The case of the gentleman found sitting upright after death had revealed its central mystery, but the final resolution remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp. The game, as Holmes would say, had entered its most perilous phase, and our serpent-bearing adversary had proven himself worthy of my friend's formidable talents. Sleep proved elusive in the hours following our confrontation at Major Thornton's villa. Holmes had taken up his characteristic position before the fireplace, his pipe forgotten between his fingers, as he stared into the dying embers with an intensity that spoke of profound mental calculation. The fog pressed against our Baker Street windows like some living thing, and in its swirling patterns I fancied I could see the ghostly outline of our serpent-bearing adversary, still at large in the labyrinthine streets of London. "He will not flee, Watson," Holmes observed suddenly, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "A man who has devoted 30 years to orchestrating such elaborate revenge does not abandon his mission merely because circumstances become more challenging. Chandra's pride has been wounded, first by our intervention at Blackwell's residence, then by his failure at Thornton's villa. Such setbacks will only intensify his determination to complete what he began." The moral labyrinth. I watched as Holmes retrieved a telegram from the accumulated correspondence on his desk, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful as he reread its contents. "Lestrade's inquiries at the ports have yielded nothing," he continued. "No passage booked under any name resembling Chandra's various aliases, no suspicious characters noted by the river police. He remains in London, Watson, which suggests either supreme confidence in his ability to evade capture or an unwillingness to leave his work unfinished." The implications troubled me deeply, not merely for the immediate danger they represented, but for the complex moral questions they raised. "Holmes," I ventured carefully, having learned more of the original injustices that drove Chandra to such extremes, "do you find your sympathies conflicted?" Holmes turned from the fire, his gray eyes reflecting an unusual uncertainty. "I am a detective, Watson, not a judge. My function is to uncover truth and apprehend criminals, not to weigh the moral balance of historical grievances. Yet I confess, this case has forced me to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice itself." He paused, drawing thoughtfully on his pipe. "When legal systems fail utterly to provide redress, when those in power abuse their authority without consequence, what alternatives remain to the powerless?" Strategic considerations. Our philosophical contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of one of Holmes's street irregulars, a sharp-eyed boy who slipped through our door with the practiced stealth of his kind. Holmes listened intently to the whispered report, occasionally nodding or asking brief, pointed questions. When the child had departed with his payment, Holmes turned to me with renewed energy. "Most illuminating, Watson. Young Wiggins reports unusual activity near the old East India Company warehouses in Limehouse. A well-dressed gentleman making inquiries about abandoned buildings suitable for private meetings. The description matches our adversary perfectly, and the location possesses a symbolic significance that would appeal to his theatrical sensibilities." Holmes began pacing before the fireplace, his movements betraying the intense mental activity that always preceded his most audacious strategies. "Chandra's pattern has been disrupted, but his fundamental psychology remains unchanged. He sees himself as an instrument of divine justice, completing a sacred duty to his father's memory. Such men require validation, Watson. They must explain their actions, justify their methods, demonstrate the righteousness of their cause." The trap conceived. "You believe he will attempt to arrange a final confrontation," I observed, recognizing the direction of his thoughts. "I believe he will demand one," Holmes corrected, "but we must ensure it occurs on ground of our choosing, under circumstances that favor justice over vengeance." He moved to his desk and began drafting a message with swift, decisive strokes. "Major Thornton remains the key, Watson. Chandra's mission cannot be complete while his final target lives. We must use that obsession against him." The plan Holmes outlined was characteristically audacious in its simplicity. Rather than waiting for Chandra to strike again at a time and place of his choosing, we would create an irresistible opportunity: the apparent transfer of Major Thornton to a more secure location, using a route and schedule that Chandra's intelligence network could easily discover. "The War Office has agreed to cooperate fully," Holmes explained as he sealed his correspondence. "Official orders will be cut transferring Thornton to a military hospital outside London, with appropriate security arrangements that appear adequate but not impenetrable. The route will pass through areas where an attack might feasibly succeed, and the timing will allow Chandra sufficient opportunity to position himself." The human element. "And Major Thornton himself?" I inquired, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Will remain safely within the War Office throughout the operation," Holmes confirmed. "The carriage will carry a substitute, someone of similar build and bearing who can maintain the deception under casual observation." The implications struck me immediately. "You intend to serve as the decoy yourself?" Holmes's thin smile held no trace of humor. "My dear Watson, while I appreciate your confidence in my theatrical abilities, I fear my features are too distinctive for such a masquerade. No, this particular performance requires an actor whose military bearing is authentic, whose courage is unquestioned, and whose reflexes have been tested under fire." The weight of his meaning settled upon me like a physical burden. Holmes was asking me to present myself as a living target for a man who could kill silently through walls and windows, who had demonstrated both remarkable ingenuity and fanatical determination. Yet the logic was undeniable. Only by drawing Chandra into direct confrontation could we hope to end his campaign permanently. The decision. "The risks are considerable," Holmes continued, his voice softening with genuine concern. "Chandra's methods are sophisticated, his preparations thorough, his desperation absolute. I cannot guarantee your complete safety, though I shall take every precaution human ingenuity can devise." I met his gaze steadily, drawing upon reserves of courage I had discovered during our previous adventures. "When do we begin preparations?" Holmes's hand briefly touched my shoulder, a rare gesture from a man who maintained such careful emotional distance. "Immediately. We have perhaps 18 hours before the transfer must commence, and every detail must be perfect. Chandra has proven himself a master of long-laid schemes, but London can still produce strategists worthy of his respect." As dawn approached through the fog-shrouded windows, I found myself contemplating the strange turns that had brought us to this point. What had begun as an impossible locked-room mystery had evolved into something far more complex. A confrontation between past and present, between justice and law, between the sins of empire and the price of revenge. The game was entering its final phase, and the stakes could not have been higher. Somewhere in the swirling mist beyond Baker Street, Vikram Chandra was preparing for what he believed would be his moment of ultimate triumph. Instead, he would face Sherlock Holmes at the height of his powers, backed by the full resources of British law and the unwavering courage of those who served justice rather than vengeance. The serpent-headed walking stick would strike once more, but this time, we would be ready. The morning of November 9th dawned gray and forbidding, with fog still clinging to the Thames like a shroud that refused to lift. Holmes had spent the intervening hours in meticulous preparation, transforming me into a convincing simulacrum of Major Thornton through careful application of theatrical makeup, strategic padding to alter my silhouette, and repeated drilling in the elderly officer's characteristic movements and posture. The military greatcoat hung heavy on my shoulders, its weight a constant reminder of the deception we were attempting. The decoy operation. "Remember, Watson," Holmes instructed as he made final adjustments to my disguise. "You must maintain the illusion only until Chandra commits himself to the attack. The moment he reveals his position, Lestrade's men will close the trap. Your primary task is survival, not heroism." The official War Office carriage awaited us in the courtyard, its brass fittings gleaming dully in the weak morning light. 2 constables in civilian dress occupied the interior, while Holmes himself would follow at a discreet distance in a separate hansom. The route had been carefully selected to provide multiple opportunities for ambush, while ensuring adequate support remained within rapid response distance. As we departed through the fog-shrouded streets of Westminster, I found myself acutely conscious of every shadow, every doorway, every figure glimpsed through the swirling mist. The carriage wheels clattered rhythmically against the cobblestones, their sound echoing off the surrounding buildings like a funeral march. My hand rested on the service revolver concealed within my coat, though I harbored no illusions about its effectiveness against an adversary who could deliver death through apparently solid barriers. The streets of deception. We had reached the narrow confines of Erasmus Street, where the old East India warehouses loomed like ghostly monuments to imperial ambition, when the quality of silence changed in that peculiar way I had learned to associate with approaching danger. The fog thickened suddenly, swirling in unnatural patterns that seemed to herald something more sinister than mere weather. A well-dressed figure materialized from the mist ahead, his military bearing unmistakable even through the obscuring vapor. Chandra stood directly in our path, the serpent-headed walking stick held with casual authority in his right hand. Yet something in his manner suggested this confrontation would not unfold as we had anticipated. "Dr. Watson," he called out, his cultured voice carrying clearly through the dampened air. How predictable! I had hoped Mr. Holmes would provide more challenging opposition than such transparent deception. The true revelation. Holmes's hansom pulled alongside at that moment, and my friend descended with swift, decisive movements. His expression combined satisfaction at the successful trap with something darker, a recognition that our victory might prove more complicated than simple apprehension. "Mr. Chandra," Holmes began, his tone respectful despite the circumstances, "your campaign of revenge has been remarkable in its planning and execution. Yet surely you must recognize that further resistance is futile." Chandra's laugh held genuine amusement rather than hysteria or despair. "Futile? Tell me, Mr. Holmes, in your thorough investigation, did you discover the true scope of my preparations? The carriage, the decoy, the elaborate chase, all of it merely theater to occupy your considerable talents, while the real work proceeded elsewhere." The implication struck me like a physical blow. "Major Thornton," I whispered, understanding flooding through me with terrible clarity. "Indeed, Doctor. While you have been playing at soldiers in this carriage, the good Major has been dying slowly in his quarters at the War Office. 3 days ago, I visited his club under an assumed identity, engaged him in conversation over brandy, and ensured his glass received a very special preparation, a compound derived from indigenous plants, virtually undetectable until its final stages." Holmes moved with sudden urgency, his usual composure cracking to reveal genuine alarm. "How long does he have?" "Perhaps an hour," Chandra replied with chilling precision. "The compound causes progressive paralysis of the respiratory system. The victim remains conscious throughout, fully aware of their approaching death, a consideration I did not extend to my father, who died in ignorance and despair." The race against time. Holmes was already signaling frantically to Lestrade while pulling me toward his hansom. "Watson, your medical knowledge may be our only hope. We must reach Thornton immediately." As our cab careened through the fog-shrouded streets toward the War Office, Holmes explained the terrible elegance of Chandra's true plan. The attacks on Edmund Blackwell, the staged confrontation at Thornton's villa, even this morning's elaborate decoy operation, all had been misdirection, designed to focus our attention on external threats, while the real danger had already been set in motion days earlier. "He knew we would eventually deduce his methods," Holmes said, his voice tight with self-recrimination. "He anticipated our intervention and prepared accordingly. While we were congratulating ourselves on protecting Thornton from the serpent-headed walking stick, the poison was already working within him." The War Office loomed through the fog like a gray fortress, its solid Victorian architecture suddenly appearing inadequate to protect against an enemy who struck from within rather than without. We burst through the entrance, our urgent demands for immediate access startling the duty officer into rapid compliance, Sir. Medical crisis. We found Major Thornton in his temporary quarters, already showing the early symptoms Chandra had described: labored breathing, progressive weakness, a terrible awareness in his eyes that spoke of approaching doom. I immediately began emergency treatment, drawing upon every resource of my medical training, while Holmes dispatched urgent messages to specialists who might possess knowledge of exotic antidotes. "Dr. Watson," Thornton managed, his voice barely above a whisper. When he offered the brandy, I recognized something in his features, knew what he intended, but I accepted anyway. "Why?" I asked, working frantically to stabilize his breathing with what limited resources were available. "Because the debt was real," he replied, his eyes holding a terrible clarity. "What we did in India, unforgivable. I have carried that burden 30 years. Perhaps it was time to pay." Holmes knelt beside the dying man, his expression reflecting an unusual depth of emotion. "Major Thornton, justice and revenge are not synonymous. What was done was wrong, but your death will not restore what was lost." The specialists arrive. The medical experts arrived within the hour, bringing with them various compounds and treatments derived from their study of indigenous poisons. Working in concert with my own efforts, we managed to slow the progression of the paralysis, buying precious time while they prepared more sophisticated interventions. The treatment was harrowing, a desperate battle between Western medical science and exotic toxicology fought within Major Thornton's failing body. For hours we worked, monitoring his vital signs, adjusting dosages, fighting to keep his respiratory system functioning while the antidotes took effect. As evening approached and Thornton's condition finally stabilized into a precarious but sustainable equilibrium, word arrived from Lestrade. Chandra had been taken into custody without resistance, apparently satisfied that his primary objective had been achieved regardless of his own fate. "He will live," I announced as the immediate crisis passed, "though his recovery will be prolonged and his breathing will never be quite the same. The damage is permanent, but not fatal." The philosophical resolution. Holmes nodded slowly, his expression reflecting the complex emotions the case had evoked. "A Pyrrhic victory for all concerned, Watson. We have saved a life and apprehended a murderer, yet the larger questions remain unanswered." Later, as we returned to Baker Street through the lifting fog, Holmes was unusually quiet. The case had challenged him in ways that pure intellectual puzzles rarely did, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of justice itself. "Chandra was a brilliant man," he observed as we settled before our familiar fire. His knowledge of chemistry, his understanding of human psychology, his patience in planning. All remarkable qualities. Had he turned those talents to constructive ends, he might have achieved greatness. Instead, he became a prisoner of history, consumed by grievances that should have been resolved through proper legal channels decades ago. I examined the serpent-headed walking stick, which Lestrade had allowed us to study before logging it into evidence. The mechanism was indeed ingenious, a masterpiece of deadly engineering disguised as a gentleman's accessory. "What becomes of him now?" "He will face trial for the murders of Sir Charles Blackwell and Colonel Weatherby, and for the attempted murder of Major Thornton. His story will be heard, his grievances acknowledged, but justice must take its course according to law, rather than personal vengeance." Holmes rose and moved to the window, watching the evening traffic begin to flow through the clearing streets. "The fog is lifting, Watson, literally and figuratively. We have illuminated the darkness surrounding these deaths, though the moral complexities will linger long after the legal proceedings conclude." The case closed. As we sat down to a late dinner, the last wisps of fog finally dispersed, revealing the familiar spires and rooftops of London bathed in pale evening light. The immediate danger had passed, the mystery solved, the criminal apprehended. Yet I could not escape the feeling that we had witnessed something larger than a simple case of murder and detection, a collision between past and present, between the sins of empire and the price of revenge, between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. The game is concluded, Holmes observed, reaching for his pipe with something approaching his usual equanimity. Yet I suspect the questions it has raised will trouble us long after the files are closed and the reports filed. Come, Watson, Mrs. Hudson has prepared an excellent meal, and we must fortify ourselves. In this great city, there will always be fresh mysteries awaiting those with eyes to see them. The case of the gentleman found sitting upright after death had reached its resolution, but the shadows it had cast would linger in our memories. We had faced an adversary whose methods were as ingenious as his motives were understandable, and in defeating him, we had been forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the line between justice and revenge is far thinner than we might wish to believe. The serpent had been captured, but the questions it had raised about the nature of justice itself would continue to coil through our thoughts long after the immediate danger had passed. The trial of Vikram Chandra commenced 3 weeks later at the Old Bailey, drawing unprecedented public attention as the most sensational case of the year. The courtroom was packed daily with representatives from the press, members of Parliament, and curious members of the public eager to witness the resolution of what newspapers had dubbed the Case of the Impossible Murders. The trial and testimony. Holmes attended every session, his keen observation revealing the complex dynamics at play. Chandra presented himself with remarkable dignity in the dock, composed, articulate, and possessed of an almost regal bearing that seemed to transform the proceedings from a simple criminal trial into something approaching a tribunal of history itself. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating, built upon the physical evidence we had painstakingly assembled. The serpent-headed walking stick, with its intricate poison delivery system, was demonstrated to the horrified fascination of the jury. Chemical analyses confirmed the exotic compounds derived from indigenous plants, while testimony from Edmund Blackwell and Major Thornton provided chilling first-hand accounts of the attacks they had survived. Yet it was Chandra's own testimony that proved most compelling. When called to account for his actions, he spoke with the measured precision of a man who had long since made peace with his choices. "I do not deny these charges," he stated, his cultured voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "I killed Sir Charles Blackwell and Colonel Weatherby. I attempted to kill Edmund Blackwell and Major Thornton. These are facts beyond dispute. What the prosecution fails to acknowledge is that these were not acts of murder, but acts of war, the final campaign in a conflict that began 30 years ago in Bengal." His defense counsel then led him through a detailed recounting of the systematic destruction of his family's fortune through fraudulent land seizures, the military pressure applied to suppress legitimate appeals, and the complete failure of legal remedies to provide any semblance of justice. Documents were produced showing the extent of the corruption and the devastating impact on numerous native families beyond the Chandras. "My father was a man of honor who believed in British justice," Chandra testified, his voice steady, despite the emotion underlying his words. "When every avenue was closed to him, when his appeals were ignored and his dignity stripped away, he chose death over dishonor. I was 14 when I found his body. From that moment, I understood that justice delayed indefinitely becomes justice denied absolutely." Holmes's complex testimony. When Holmes was called to testify, his account demonstrated the characteristic precision and objectivity that had made him famous. Yet I detected subtle acknowledgement of the moral complexities that made this case unique among our experiences. "The defendant's methods were ingenious beyond anything I have encountered," Holmes stated under examination. "His knowledge of chemistry, his understanding of human psychology, his ability to anticipate and counter investigative efforts, all demonstrated capabilities of the highest order. Had these talents been directed toward legitimate, scientific pursuits, Mr. Chandra might have achieved distinction in any number of fields." Under cross-examination by the defense, Holmes was pressed about the historical context. "Mr. Holmes," the barrister inquired, "in your professional opinion, were the original crimes committed against the Chandra family of sufficient magnitude to explain, if not justify, the defendant's subsequent actions?" Holmes paused, his gray eyes thoughtful. "The injustices were real and profound. The failure of legal systems to provide redress was complete. However, I am here to testify about criminal methods, not to adjudicate historical grievances. The defendant chose revenge, which he perceived as justice denied by conventional means." The verdict and its aftermath. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning their inevitable verdict: guilty on all charges. The evidence was overwhelming, the facts clearly established. Yet several jurors appeared troubled as they delivered their decision, suggesting the historical testimony had not been without effect. The judge sentenced Chandra to death by hanging, as the law required, though his remarks acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances that had driven an otherwise capable man to such extremes. He recommended the case for review by the Home Secretary, noting the complex historical factors that distinguished it from ordinary criminal matters. The final act. 3 days before his scheduled execution, Chandra was found dead in his cell at Newgate Prison. The discovery sent shockwaves through the legal establishment and the public alike, for he had been found sitting perfectly upright on his cot, in a posture of serene meditation, precisely mirroring the position in which his victims had been discovered. The prison physician determined that death had resulted from a minute capsule of concentrated poison, derived from the same exotic compounds Chandra had used in his murders. How he had managed to conceal this final dose throughout his incarceration remained a mystery, though it spoke to the same meticulous planning that had characterized his entire campaign. A note was found beside his body, written in his precise hand. "To those who would judge me, I have completed my father's work and answered history's call. I die as I lived these past 30 years, in service to justice delayed, but not denied. The debt is now truly collected." The hidden truth revealed. In the aftermath of Chandra's death, one final mystery remained to be solved. The Indian figurine stolen by Arthur Fenwick had been returned to Edmund Blackwell, who requested that Holmes examine it before placing it in the family vault. During this examination, Holmes discovered a hidden compartment in the statue's base, activated by manipulating what appeared to be decorative elements. Within this secret chamber lay a folded document, the original deed of seizure for the Chandra estates, bearing the signatures of Barrington, Blackwell, and Weatherby. The paper was yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved, providing incontrovertible proof of the conspiracy that had destroyed Chandra's family 3 decades earlier. So that was his true objective, I realized, as Holmes held the damning document to the light. Not merely revenge, but vindication, proof that his father's destruction was deliberate and systematic. Holmes nodded gravely. Sir Charles kept it as a trophy, never realizing it was the warrant for his own execution. This document would have provided legal grounds for challenging the seizures, had it been discovered 30 years ago. Hidden in plain sight, it became the foundation for Chandra's obsession. Character resolutions. Major Thornton survived his poisoning but never fully recovered, the damage to his respiratory system proving permanent, though manageable. He spent his remaining years providing testimony to parliamentary inquiries into colonial abuses, his honest accounts contributing significantly to growing reform movements. When he passed peacefully 18 months later, it was with the knowledge that he had made what restitution lay within his power. Edmund Blackwell, profoundly shaken by his brush with death and the revelations about his family's past, withdrew from London society to manage his estates with newfound humility. He established a charitable foundation dedicated to education and legal advocacy for those affected by historical injustices throughout the empire, though he made no public claims about its purpose or his motivations. Arthur Fenwick, cleared of all suspicion regarding the murders, returned to his work at the Pantheon Theatre with a deeper appreciation for the weight that objects can carry. He never again dabbled in matters beyond his understanding, finding sufficient drama in the legitimate theater without seeking it in the darker corners of human experience. Holmes's final reflection: on a clear spring evening, as the last traces of winter fog finally lifted from London's streets, Holmes and I sat before our familiar fire discussing the broader implications of the case. The moral complexity of the affair continued to occupy our thoughts long after the legal proceedings had concluded. "We are accustomed to viewing crime as an aberration, Watson," Holmes observed, his pipe sending contemplative spirals toward the ceiling. "A disruption of natural order that must be corrected through investigation and apprehension. Yet in this case, the crimes were themselves an attempt to correct a disruption that occurred decades ago. Chandra's tragedy was not that he sought justice, but that he believed vengeance could provide it." I watched as Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace, holding the incriminating document we had discovered. "What becomes of this evidence now?" Holmes held the paper to the flames, watching as the yellowed parchment caught fire and curled into ash. "Let the dead bury their dead, Watson. The living have enough burdens to carry without adding the weight of history to their load. Truth has been served. The rest is for philosophers and historians to debate." As the last traces of the document disappeared into smoke, I felt a profound sense of closure settle over the room. The case of the gentleman found sitting upright after death had begun as a puzzle of impossible physics and evolved into a tragedy of impossible morals. We had solved the mystery, illuminated the truth, and witnessed the final accounting of debts that should never have been incurred. The lasting impact. In the months that followed, several parliamentary inquiries were launched into historical injustices committed during the expansion of British India. The Blackwell-Weatherby affair became a case study in the dangers of unchecked colonial authority, though meaningful reforms proved as elusive as they had been 30 years earlier. Some truths, it seemed, were easier to acknowledge than to address. Holmes received numerous requests to consult on similar cases involving historical grievances and delayed justice, but he declined them all. "I am a detective, Watson," he explained, "not a confessor for the sins of empire. Let others wrestle with the ghosts of history. I prefer mysteries that can be solved rather than tragedies that can only be endured." Conclusion. "Come, Watson," Holmes said finally, turning from the fireplace with renewed energy as the sound of an approaching carriage reached our ears. "I believe our next client arrives, and judging by the urgency of that approach, we face a puzzle that belongs entirely to the present. The past has claimed enough of our attention." As I reached for my coat, I reflected on the extraordinary journey this case had taken us on, from locked rooms and impossible deaths to the moral labyrinth of historical injustice and personal revenge. We had solved the mystery and apprehended the criminal, yet the victory felt incomplete, shadowed by recognition that the deeper questions admitted no simple answers. The fog had lifted from London's streets, but some mysteries, it seemed, were destined to remain forever shrouded in moral ambiguity. And perhaps, as Holmes would say, that was as it should be, for life rarely provides the neat resolutions that detective stories promise, and wisdom lies in acknowledging complexity rather than forcing false certainty. The game was concluded, but its lessons would endure. In the gaslit streets of Victorian London, we had witnessed the collision of past and present, of justice and revenge, of the sins of empire and the price of remembrance. The serpent had been captured and the debt collected, but the shadows cast by those ancient wrongs would linger long after the immediate danger had passed. The case was closed, the files organized, the reports submitted. Yet among all our adventures together, the affair of the serpent-headed walking stick would remain unique, not merely for its intellectual challenges, but for the uncomfortable truths it had forced us to confront about the nature of justice itself. The spring of 1895 arrived with unusual warmth, banishing the last vestiges of winter fog and transforming London into a city renewed. Yet even as Holmes resumed his characteristic energy for fresh puzzles, I sensed that the moral complexities of the Chandra affair continued to occupy his thoughts in ways that purely intellectual mysteries never had. The Final Testament. It was on a particularly pleasant April afternoon that our doorbell rang, with an urgency that immediately captured Holmes's attention. The gentleman who entered our sitting room was perhaps 60 years of age, distinguished in bearing, with features that suggested Indian heritage tempered by generations in England. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began without preamble. "I am Sir Rajesh Kapoor, legal counsel to several Indian commercial interests. I have come regarding Vikram Chandra, with matters he entrusted to me before his death." From his leather case, Sir Rajesh withdrew a sealed envelope bearing Chandra's distinctive handwriting, along with detailed schematics of the serpent-headed walking stick. Holmes accepted both documents with unusual reverence, his expression shifting through surprise, comprehension, and finally, profound thoughtfulness. The letter revealed that Chandra's campaign of revenge had been merely the visible portion of a much larger undertaking. Over 30 years, he had systematically documented every instance of colonial abuse he could discover, creating an archive of evidence that would otherwise have been lost to history. This collection now awaited proper disposition to ensure accountability rather than continued concealment. "I sought not merely personal vengeance," Chandra had written, "but systemic accountability. If my actions contribute even marginally to preventing repetition of such injustices, then my life will have served a purpose beyond simple revenge." The archive and its impact. Holmes ultimately crafted a solution that balanced competing imperatives with characteristic ingenuity. The archive was delivered to a specially convened parliamentary committee with copies provided to reform organizations, ensuring the evidence could not be quietly buried. The process was gradual and methodical, allowing for considered response rather than precipitating crisis. The parliamentary committee eventually published a comprehensive report, citing Chandra's documentation as crucial evidence. Modest reforms were implemented, compensation provided to some affected families, and several historical injustices officially acknowledged. The process was imperfect and incomplete, but it represented more accountability than would have existed without Chandra's decades of meticulous documentation. Character resolutions. Major. Thornton's subsequent testimony before the parliamentary committee provided crucial first-hand accounts of administrative abuses. His honesty cost him remaining social connections among former military colleagues, but he seemed to find peace in finally speaking truth about matters he had carried silently for decades. Edmund Blackwell's charitable foundation grew into a significant force for reform, though he never publicly acknowledged its connection to his family's historical wrongdoing. Arthur Fenwick found unexpected success with theatrical productions exploring themes of justice and revenge, the experience having transformed a dissolute young man into a thoughtful artist whose work engaged seriously with moral complexity. Holmes's reflection. One evening, as we sat before our fireplace enjoying the mild weather, Holmes spoke with unusual introspection. "Watson, the Chandra affair has forced me to recognize that reality is often far more complex than our comfortable categories suggest. We solved the mystery, apprehended the criminal, and prevented further murders. Yet we also acknowledged that the crimes occurred within a context of historical injustice that demanded recognition. The schematic drawing of the walking stick, inscribed with Chandra's final message, 'Ingenuity without justice is merely clever cruelty,' remained in Holmes's private files as a reminder that brilliance directed toward destruction represents perhaps the most profound tragedy of all. The lasting legacy. The case is truly concluded now," Holmes observed as we received word that the parliamentary report had been published. From impossible locked-room mystery to historical tragedy to modest reform, quite a journey for a single investigation. I nodded, recognizing the profound transformation we had both undergone. The neat solutions of detective work had revealed messier human realities, that motives can be understandable even when actions are condemned, that victims can be perpetrators and perpetrators victims, that the line between justice and revenge is often drawn in shades of gray. The final word. Perhaps this, Watson, Holmes concluded, his keen eyes gazing into the fire, that justice delayed is indeed justice denied, but vengeance is not justice by another name. Legal systems must be held accountable when they fail, but individual violence cannot substitute for collective reform. The past casts long shadows, but we must learn to walk in them without being consumed by darkness. He turned to me with his characteristic slight smile, energy returning. And now, my dear Watson, somewhere in this great city, new mysteries await those with eyes to see them and courage to pursue them. As we prepared for whatever challenge might next ascend our familiar 17 steps, I reflected that the case of the gentleman found sitting upright after death had achieved as much justice as an imperfect world could provide. The serpent had been captured, the debt acknowledged if not fully paid, and the shadows of the past brought into the light of honest examination.